Hi, welcome back to another episode of Tim's Garage and my continuing project on my 2007 Saturn Sky Redline. I am to the point now where I have begun the process of tuning the car, and on my last video when I talked about the turbo, I was talking about making sure that you had enough preload on the wastegate actuator. That's this item right here. I wanted to make sure that this little nut assembly was adjusted correctly, and I'll go through how to do that. What we want to do in terms of making sure this is adjusted is we loosen off the upper nut and we loosen off the lower nut until we get to the point that we have everything loosened. And then once the lower nut is loose enough, you take this whole arm and you move the arm up against so you push the arm this way, and when you hold a little bit of pressure on it with your finger, you tighten this nut up to the base of the shaft. You then take it an additional 2.5 to 3 turns, tightening it up, and then once you've got your 2.5 to 3 turns up on this nut, you then back this nut down and then you lock them together. Now, I had gone through the process of adjusting that, and one of the challenges I had is that it seemed like it kept moving. And I wound up readjusting it several times. And each time I would adjust it, I would instantly get 24 pounds of boost at about 3,200 RPM. It would come in very quickly and just stay at 24 pounds of boost. And after 5, 6, 7 drives, it would start to become random. Sometimes I'd get 22 pounds of boost. Sometimes I'd get 18 pounds of boost. All the boost would then take a very long time to build and climb and become available for the car to be able to run, and it was extremely frustrating. So this randomness of the boost had me wondering, what on earth it could be. So one of the things that I did is, as I started going through and trying to diagnose this, I realized that because every time I readjusted the wastegate actuator on this little assembly here, the car would run great. And what I found is that on this particular wastegate actuator, this is the amount, you can see how much that moves in and out. It's about 1/8 of an inch or about 1/16 of an inch of preload in and out into that little assembly. Well, I found out quite by accident that on mine, that little bit of movement was actually about 1/2 an inch to 7/16 of an inch. And I'll include an image showing how far that moved out of the housing. Now, because it moved out that far, what it was allowing to happen is as this piece moves in and out, you can see that it moves the wastegate itself in and out. You see the wastegate in here? It moves that in and out. And what it was doing is the housing that houses the shaft for the wastegate arm had actually come out of the turbo and slid out. When it slid out like that, it would allow the wastegate to randomly sometimes cover the hole completely and then other times leave it uncovered. And I'll show an image of what it looked like uncovered. Now, with it uncovered like that, it was allowing exhaust gases to escape around the turbo impeller. And by it escaping past the turbo impeller, it created very little boost, and boost would take a long time to build. But each time I initially adjusted this, I wound up with it working perfectly for like 2 or 3 drives, and then it wouldn't again. And it was making me crazy. So I just want to thank heavens that I dealt with a very reputable provider, and after identifying what the problem was, and I had my vendor working through this with me. They were trying to help me diagnose this all along. We thought perhaps there was a leak in the boost track somewhere in the intercooler or in one of the charge pipes. When I found this mechanical problem, one of the benefits of working with a good vendor is there was no question that I had a new turbo on its way, and I want to give a shout out to Martin Scott over at RPM Motorsports. They completely took care of me and made sure that I had a quality product to put back on the car. And he hasn't had a failure like that, but in manufacturing things can happen. This is something completely unrelated to the big wheel upgrade. It was something in the the wastegate actuator assembly that was manufactured by a third party, and it's just one of those things. So the good news is I found it. So going forward, when you go to install one of these turbos, there's a couple of checklists you need to do. Number one, when you go to install the turbo, you want to make sure you check the wastegate actuator preload, and that should be anywhere from 2.5 to 3 turns on the lower nut after you get all of the clearance, so that this doesn't move all on its own, okay? It pushes up against the spring, and when you've got it pushed up against the spring nice and tight, you do 3 additional turns on the lower nut, and then you back the upper nut back down and lock it in place. If you want to just leave it assembled as the manufacturer sent it to you, that's fine too. I wanted to check it. The next thing you want to check is you want to check and make sure that the actual wastegate actuator is moving at the pressure that you think it needs to move at. And I'm told that it should open about 6 psi, and then it should be fully open by about 12 psi. So I've got a little gauge here, and I'm using my Mighty Vac MV8500 vacuum and pressure gauge. So I'm going to use this little Mighty Vac tool and watch as I build up pressure. So I've got, okay. So what I'm going to do is apply a little pressure, and you can see it just started to move right there, just barely. Okay, see it started to open at about 6.5 psi, and then if we continue to apply pressure, it'll continue to open, and as we continue to apply pressure, we're up to 10 psi right now. It's still moving, so it's moving against the spring. We're at 12 psi, and that's it. So at 12 psi, it's fully wide open, and it started to open at about 6.5 psi. So this actuator assembly is working correctly, so I can go ahead and I can reassemble everything, and it's ready to go. Now, if you want to see how this works, if we look down inside the chamber here, when the engine wants to build boost, you can see that the wastegate is closed up against this little orifice that's right here. This disc prevents gases from bypassing the turbo impeller. As we start to open that, you can see that door open up, and there's a large cavity in the back that allows exhaust gases around past this door, and it can divert it past the impeller for the turbo that's right here, and it allows it to not build as much boost. It now allows that exhaust gases to take the path of least resistance and no longer drive the impeller, adding additional boost to the engine. So that's in a nutshell how the internal wastegate works. Okay, so once you verify that those two things are there, the last tip I have for installing this is the GM tube that mounts on the bottom of the turbo. So it mounts like this on the turbo, mounts on the bottom. This is the return line for oil. One of the challenges with these is as they get old, they're just a hose, and they're flexible, and they crack and break, okay? I found from Mamba Motorsports a very beautiful replacement for that comes with a billet housing that mounts on the base of the turbo, and then this mounts onto the threaded fitting, and then the other end here drops down into the engine. Now, this is a far superior tube to the original GM line. Is it going to add any horsepower? Not at all, but it certainly will be nice and durable. So I'm going to put some heat shielding on this, and I'm going to wind up using this rather than the factory unit, just so that I have something that's a little more durable. Now, one other thing that's a little nicer on the Mamba unit is it's slightly a smaller diameter on the steel, so it actually, when the O-ring is installed on there, pushes into the little drain back hole much easier than this one. And this was a bit of a problem when I installed the turbo the last time. It was very difficult to get in, and I was concerned that maybe it didn't quite make it in. But you can notice on the Mamba Motorsport one, it's got a little chamfer, helps guide it into the engine, and it's got an extended shaft here that drops down into the smaller hole, helping center this in the opening rather than just trying to get it to drop straight into the opening while you're trying to get the turbo in around all the lines that are in the way when you're trying to install it back on the motor. So those are just some checklist items for the turbo. I'm going to have this on sometime this week, and finally I'll be able to take this thing and get it over to the dyno and figure out exactly how much horsepower it made. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, choose like and subscribe, and if you can, tell your friends. It'd be great. Thank you for watching.